Good morning, folks. We're going to discuss that last part of the introductory chapter that pertains to logical analysis. Now, the first question I have in our bullet points here is, what's an argument and why should we be concerned about arguments and argumentation? Now, for our purposes, an argument will be made in support of a position that someone or some group of people wants to convince us of. They will need to state their conclusion and/or their thesis and provide supporting reasons for that thesis. Now, part of what we're going to be looking at is the structure of arguments that pass logical muster. An argument that passes structural logical muster is called a valid argument. Now, I state this in all my classes where I talk about logic. Many students have difficulty with this concept of validity because of the colloquial misuse of the word valid in everyday conversation. If you've ever heard a person say, I think that that statement is valid, my quick response there is, statements are not valid or invalid. Statements are true or false or undetermined. Validity and truth are not one and the same thing. As a matter of fact, validity is an issue of the argument structure. There are argument structures that are valid ones, and we will be, in the course of the next week, we will see some typically very simple, valid logical structures. Arguments that are logically not well constructed are invalid arguments. One way that an argument can fail is that it can fail to be structurally good. It can be invalid. Now, the other thing that we need to look at, which is separate from validity, is the truth value of the premises. In other words, we call the question, are the premises that are in this argument likely true? Or do we have good reason to believe that one or more of them might be false? If we determine that the argument meets the standard of validity and that its premises are true, it has met the two criterion that an argument must meet in order to be called this. A sound argument will be valid and its premises are true. True premises are not enough for an acceptable argument. Valid structure is not enough for the logical acceptability of an argument. It has to meet both of these criteria. That's kind of the punchline of this section. What we're going to talk about next are various examples that the author of the text runs through to show you the variety of ways, via example, that an argument can fall into error. Now, the first two examples that the author gives, and I'm not going to read the examples, they are short passages from the 19th century in the US of A. They were two men, American politicians, arguing for various positions while accepting the viewpoints held by slavers. How many of you remember reading these examples? Now, the author's point here is these arguments that are being presented are based upon a false set of assumptions. a false set of assumptions that some people believed, but it was because of the collective ignorance of their times. As a matter of fact, they thought that their falsehoods were based upon good science. The problem is what? They were not based in good scientific standards at all. Arguments based upon false premises and false assumptions will fail because they fail to meet this criterion right here. That's one way an argument can fail. Clearly false premises and false assumptions will lead to a flawed argument that will be unsound. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple of other examples that the author lays out in, I guess, logical format, for lack of a better phrase for it. And I have this on the in my notes, but I'll write it down for you. Here's the first example. Premise one is heroin is a drug. Premise two is selling heroin, should have better pens, is illegal. Therefore, heroin use is immoral. Now, I'll cut to the chase here. The point the author's trying to make here is that both of our premises are what? True. Heroin is indeed a drug. Lots of things are drugs. Caffeine is a drug, et cetera, et cetera. Heroin is a drug. This is a true premise. Selling heroin is illegal. This is also a true premise. Now, folks, we don't even have to look at the conclusion. Regardless of whether or not this conclusion is true or false, is irrelevant, because the problem made in this argument is a structural one. And by my calling it a structural problem, I'm saying it is unsound. Yeah, well, it's unsound, but invalid first. Yeah. It's an invalid argument. Now, how do I know it's invalid? Well, because there are no things in premise one and premise two that clearly connect to one another. They might look like they're connected to one another because they both say something about heroin. But they are, in fact, not logically connected to one another. Because this one merely makes the statement that heroin is a drug. This says something about heroin's being illegal. We say nothing about the relationships of drugs and illegality to connect the two. And there's an even bigger problem. Even if these things somehow connected the two to one another, you'll notice that this one talks about heroin being illegal. You'll notice that the conclusion draws what further statement? Yeah, this says something about its being immoral. Word one has not been said about its being immoral in the premises. Ergo, this person is trying to draw a conclusion that literally does not relate to anything said in the premises. There would need to be additional premises to make those connections, such as doing illegal things is immoral. Folks, that probably wouldn't work either. Why? Because most of you probably believe there's plenty of things that might be illegal that aren't necessarily what? Aren't necessarily immoral. And there's plenty of things that are immoral that are not illegal. In other words, I don't see any way to save this argument the way it's put together. It would need far too much work in order to set the thing up in a valid way. So this one fails structurally, even though the premises are in fact true. Now let's look at the next one. Here's another case. John Quincy Adams was either the 8th or the 9th president. Folks, this is how we could write this down as logical structure. John Quincy Adams was either the 8th president or he was the 9th president. Now the second premise says, but he was not the 8th president. And folks, this is the way in propositional logic symbolizing these two premises would look. This little symbol right here, that is the symbol in propositional logic that stands for the concept or. Not E would look like this. You wondered where that tilde on your keyboard came in handy? Well, we use it in propositional logic symbols. It means not the case. Now the conclusion is E or N, but not E, therefore it must be N. Folks, the author of the text doesn't give you all this detail, but I will. This is a valid structure called deductively valid structure called disjunctive syllogism. The reason why it's a valid structure is it makes the statement, it's this or it's this. And remember, our common sense usage of the word or means this. One or the other of these, if this statement is true, will be true. Now, in the second premise, we say, but it's not this one. Well, therefore, it must be this one. And by the way, folks, if you think, well, that's obvious, why did you have to tell me that? Well, that's the nice thing about deductive reasoning. If the arguments don't get overly complex, the conclusions will actually be fairly obvious if you're paying attention. This is a valid structure, but the author clearly snuck in what? Misinformation. Yeah, specifically a false premise. The first premise of this is false. John Quincy Adams was the 6th president of the United States. So this is an example of a deductive argument that is valid. Its structure is a valid one, but it is unsound because it has a false premise. Got to pay attention to the structure. And once it meets the structural test, you ask, are the premises true? If the premises are true and the structure is valid, the conclusion will be necessarily true. Next one. The author looks at two arguments next surrounding the morality of meat eating. We'll see some moral problems essays on this later on. Now let me read this argument. It is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat other animals. Therefore, it is morally acceptable for human beings to kill and eat non-human animals. It is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat other animals. Therefore, it is moral for humans to kill and eat other animals. Folks, I have heard meat eaters make this argument before. The problem with this one is it fails on it fails on structural grounds. In other words, this is invalid. This one fails on both grounds. It is structurally problematic, and the premise is false. By the way, the falsity of the premise is very subtle. Now you'll notice this one right here simply talks about non-human animals eating non-human animals. This one draws a conclusion about human animals eating non-human animals. And as Asher accurately put out, there is no other premises or no other premise that actually makes any connection about human animals. In other words, no connection made about things that non-human animals are allowed to do ought to be things that human animals are allowed to do. It has a structural flaw. The other major problem is the premise is false. I'll read it to you. It is moral for non-human animals to kill and eat other animals. This one's subtle. But if you read the entire chapter, you know why this premise is false. To say that it is moral for non-human animals to do anything fails to understand the nature of non-human animals. The word that you need to put in your data bags now and not to forget is a concept that goes all the way back to our ancient Greek forebears, who started these philosophical endeavors in Western civilization. Animals are not what we call agents. I hope you saw that word agent in the textbook. We typically believe that human beings possess something called agency. Agency refers to the fact that because we have the capacity for rational deliberation, that is, we can think about things, and therefore we can regulate our own behavior to some extent. In other words, we are not purely driven by instinct. We can deliberate about something and say, no, I won't do that, or no, I shouldn't do that. You might hear this also called volition or free will. But yeah, those are the kind of things that center around this concept called agency. Animals lack agency. This is why talking about animals being moral is a false statement, because animals don't have that capacity. And because animals don't have that capacity, it is irrelevant what they do and don't do to what we should or shouldn't do. Now notice I said what they do, and then I said what we should or shouldn't do. When we talk about what we do, we're merely talking about descriptive accounts of behavior. That's not what ethics is in the business of talking about. Ethics is not concerned with what we do. It's concerned with what we should do. In other words, it makes prescriptive claims, not merely descriptive claims. This shouldn't say that it is moral for animals. It should say animals eat other animals. That's not an ethical statement. That's a descriptive statement. And guess what? Most philosophers have contended that descriptive statements couldn't get you to an ethical statement anyway. Because descriptions merely say what we do, not what we should or ought to do. I hope I didn't go overboard on that one. I wanted to be thorough, because there's one more to look at. The author next says, hey, maybe we can do a save here. Maybe we can reconstruct this argument in a way that might make it acceptable. Punchline, it's not going to work. It's not going to work, but let's do it anyway. This one says, if it is moral for non-human animals to kill and eat one another, actually, I'm going to do this. If it is moral for non-human animals to kill and eat one another, then it is moral for human animals to kill and eat one another. Now, I have the full thing written in my notes, so I've done what? I have taken big chunks of context, and I have reduced them to a letter that will stand in for that context. I just have to make sure that when I see that content again, that I use the right letter to fill in so I can see what the structure is. Now, the second premise says, it is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat one another. So that second premise, I have just symbolized simply as N. And the conclusion says, therefore, it is morally acceptable for humans to kill and eat non-human animals. Now, this is in my notes on D2L, but the author doesn't go into this detail in the textbook. I wish the author did, because it helps to have the terminology. Folks, this is a deductively valid form called, I want you to know this. This is a deductively valid structure called modus ponens. Don't worry, it's a peculiar Latin phrase. All it really means is that we just affirm the antecedent of this premise. For those of you who haven't heard this lingo before, this if-then statement logicians refer to as a conditional. The reason why we call it a conditional is because this if-then says, on condition that this is true, this will also be true. That's why we call it a conditional. So if N, then H. Now the second premise says, yes, it's the case that therefore H. This is a deductively valid structure. And you remember what I said about deductively valid structures? If the argument is valid and the premises are true, then the conclusion will also be true. So this argument right here is valid. That's what I meant by the author said, let's reconfigure this argument and see if we can save this argument. So he set it up as a valid argument. It is structurally a good one now. But guess what? It's still unsound. For the same reason that the last argument was unsound. Because both of these premises are what? Valid structure, 2 false premises. This says, if it is morally acceptable for non-human animals to kill and eat one another, then it's acceptable for human animals to kill and eat non-human animals. That whole statement about moral acceptability for animals already makes this statement a false one, because they're not what? Yeah, perfect. Animals are not agents. And guess what? Evaluating this argument as unsound, 1 false premise, we can stop. Because all you need is 1 false premise or the structure to be invalid, and you can know the argument's unsound, because it has to meet both criteria. Now, folks, the reason why this second premise is false too, even though we don't need to go this far, is again because animals are not agents. Now, this was my, I hope not too long-winded of a lecture, because this was really just about 5 pages in the book. But they're fairly critical pages, because I know some of you who have never had any direct encounter with logic before. And admittedly, if you've had no direct encounter with logic before, you probably need somebody to talk you through it. And by the way, please don't take that as an insult. I needed somebody to talk me through it. It's the kind of stuff that if you're not accustomed to it, it's difficult to handle it using the textbook alone. Particularly if somebody's not going through it step by step. And that's why I wanted to spend a little more time doing this. Now, the aim here was to show that there are a number of ways that an argument can go wrong. And note, folks, if an argument is a sound argument, ergo one that you ought to accept, it's got to meet the validity criterion, and it also has to have premises that are more than likely true. Now, let's say that we're looking at an argument in the textbook moving forward, and guess what? We will. The kind of things that we will do when we are analyzing an argument is we will first see if we can determine what the structure is. And if the structure is indeed a valid structure, it would pass that test. If it passes the validity test, the next thing we do is we look at the premises. We ask, are there good reasons for us to dispute either one or more of these premises? And take a guess who will help you with that. Yeah, we will be talking through these things, but this is frequently the kind of thing that the author will do, when he kind of adds logical rigor to this discussion. He will actually go through the process of showing how one might critique one or more of the premises. Now, don't worry, we will be looking at more logical analysis in the very near future, as well as seeing some more structures that are valid. Thanks.